Our next speaker will be Patrick McGrath. Patrick is the Associate Director at IST, the RCT Content Management Services. And Patrick is wobbling because he just had surgery yesterday on his knee. So Patrick, are you going to stand here, or are you going to? All right. It's all yours, Patrick.
I wanted to talk about two major things today. One is paper, which has its merits, and one is about the records management situation on campus. And firstly, in IST, we've got a number of different things going. I'm part of a group called Research and Content Technologies. So we actually do structured and non-structured data support effectively for a number of research and a number of non-research content domains. So that's anything from imaging through document management. We've got a number of services that deal with business process and workflow, content integration. We're trying to start some efforts up on records management, which we'll talk about today, and we're doing a whole bunch of things around web content management, things like Drupal sites and so on. So I saw this a little while ago, and it was kind of a horrendous number. So this is a 2010 stat from EMC, who are a content management company, funnily enough. 200 million tons is a lot of tons of paper. Does anyone have any number in their head about how much paper UC Berkeley uses? Can I get a number from the crowd? 2 tons? A bit more than that? All right. So in 2010, when we were doing some OE research, we found out that Berkeley had basically purchased over 60 million pages from one of our larger paper vendors. And knowing that people actually get paper from outside those vendors, or that vendor, and we do things like outsourced printing, I came up with a random number of 67 million pages, of which 81% is recycled, which is actually a good thing, and we're actually better at recycling or getting recycled paper than many other institutions. But I can't comprehend what 67 million pages of paper looks like. So I did some thinking about it. 135,000 reams of paper. That's a lot. If you put it, if it was all the same stock and all the same paper, that'd be a stack of paper 4.77 miles high. That just seems a lot to me. Or we could put it in the stadium on the football field, 4 inches thick for the whole football field. That's a lot of paper too. 336 tons of paper, which accumulates in its production to about a little over 2,000 tons of CO2 in the making of that paper. So that's a staggeringly high amount from what I thought it would be. I don't know about you guys. So what does that cost? Well, I found on Google a paper cost estimator, and it came out with an interesting number that said, based on the assumptions of $3.29 a ream, thereabouts, 81% of the paper we got is recycled, about 1% we shred, and 95% we throw away, fairly close to when it's printed. Those are random numbers, but I think they're reasonable random numbers. So that comes into the front end cost of about $7.5 million a year to basically buy that paper, print on that paper, and get rid of 95% of it, which seems like a lot of money to me too. So if I printed that all out at a cost of $7.5 million, the cost of managing that paper outside the front end, so this is around the 5% or so that we store, gets these kind of costs associated with it. And these are horrendous numbers when you think about it in terms of total cost. These are the people that are handling the paper, filing it, going through files for discovery and all sorts of things like that. And on average, 5% of the documents you're looking for get lost, which have to get recreated. Do these numbers kind of resonate with anybody? So I put in a spreadsheet of very high recommendations. I graduated with a degree in crude arithmetic. And so if EMC's numbers hold true, I calculated that out to be about 50 million in terms of cost associated with that 5% of those documents, in terms of a total cost. I put the spreadsheet in there to make it sound like I actually did some arithmetic. And so that 50 million would be credible. It's probably not credible at all, but it really goes to show that we actually need to take a look into what we're doing with paper on the campus, because it's a significant spend. And that's, again, not just the paper itself, not just the printers, the maintenance, the mailing, the filing, the searching. There's a lot of very, very big costs associated with dealing with that volume of paper. So I was thinking about that, and it was like, all right, well, how are we going to deal with this from a records management perspective? So A, we've got to cut down the usage of paper, period, ideally. People have been trying to do that for 20 years or so. It hasn't really worked all that well so far. But why an enterprise approach? So ultimately, we're dealing with a lot of silo tools, and this is, many organizations deal with this kind of problem. Each department has their own type of thing that they're using. There hasn't been a lot of enterprise-level leadership that's been taking place, and so people are dealing with things that they've got to get up and running quickly. They don't want to deal with the horrendous complexity or the slowness of central departments like mine. And ultimately, they create their own solutions for managing their stuff. Interestingly, as you start taking a look at that across 300 departments, for example, on campus, there's a lot of duplication. And we were seeing that, for example, when we were going through the Chancellor's office. We actually keep information in paper. We duplicate that in the electronic form. We don't throw away the paper because there's still some real comfort and confidence issues that exist with that. But in many of the places that have submitted those bits of paper, they're also maintaining a copy, and they may have written something on it, and because there's all of this duplication, you don't really know if you're like looking at the latest copy or the best copy or the one with all of the annotations and so on. And so you start getting this huge duplication with slight differences, which makes it no longer a duplication. Some of it's enhanced, some of it's not. But it's just a big mess. We've got a lot of reactive one-off approaches. So e-discovery is, or discovery in general, is a really big issue. So I was talking with Leanne actually last week, and we were talking about, for example, one chap that I'd been chatting with at a conference that said it just cost him $3 million for the last single discovery request that he was managing inside his health insurance organization. And because we're subject to public records, inquiries and so on, the cost for us to be able to be reactive to that responsibility can actually get pretty high over a period of time. There's a real disconnect between retention schedules and how our business works. And I think one of the things that you take a look at here, we're an organization that has no shortage of policy, right? What we do have a shortage of in many cases are accessible. How do we make those policies things that people can actually use? How do we provide services so that it's actually easier for people to do the right thing with their data because they want to? And we actually have a real chasm between the policy and the implementation of the policy, especially when you get a lot of change in the environment and so on. People are turning over, sometimes in their graves, on a frequent schedule. And we've got a behavior pattern that says, hey, when in doubt, I'll just keep on storing it, right? Because if it's too onerous for us to be able to manage retention and disposal schedules, then you're just going to say, I'm not going to bother with it. It's in the too hard drawer, too hard filing cabinet, whatever. And I'd actually be interested out of this crowd that's here today, how many people actually regularly cull their email? That's staggeringly high. And I believe you're also on Vicodin. I don't believe that. Okay. So I'm great at stealing slides. So here's a couple of stolen slides. And I'm not going to go through all of this stuff. You can read it when I'm gone and laugh. But ultimately, the way that we typically practice records management, it's untenable. It's not sustainable. It's not oriented towards good data quality because we're rushing. There's not a lot of curation time that's really spent by not the records manager necessarily, but perhaps by the submitter of those records into the file. And obviously, the sooner you can get good metadata in the life cycle of these documents, the better chance you're going to have to get information out. E-discovery is getting more difficult and more expensive. So the volume of what we're dealing with is just exploding. It's really, really hard to kind of keep up with. If I want this piece of information, I've got to talk to this person or go to this file. They're running a SharePoint system over here, and I'm running an Alfresco system over there, and somebody's got some stuff on Google Docs. We're just exploding in the number of formal and informal solutions that are being used, basically, to manage a lot of this data. And storage management is becoming really chronic and really expensive for IT. So even if we did digitize everything, putting it on a system, the costs are not going down as quickly as the volume of content is growing, right? So there's basic math involved in that. So why is records management a priority? And in fact, I believe electronic records management is a priority. First of all, it would seem that there's a huge potential for savings, whether that be through the amount of floor space that we can release, the amount of time that people are actually spending, handling records to file them. We're dealing usually with data that is, in one sense or another, at some point, mission critical. And this is happening at the same time as we've got a lot of staff turnover. A lot of people have got filing systems in their head, and we congratulate them for their 30 years of service. They walk out the door, and it's like, well, what is that box again? And that happens. It happens on laptops. It happens on filing cabinets all the time. And we've got an aging workforce, right? So we're going to see a lot more turnover. We're also at a time where there's huge organizational change. So for those of us that have been impacted by OE so far, this is just the beginning. So we've got significant investments in our existing staff, in our existing systems. Many of those systems are going to get overhauled. We've got things like the Shared Services Center coming up, so the processes are changing. The location of our records may be changing. We're not quite sure where they're going to go and who's going to be responsible for them. And I think coming up with some standardized approaches here are going to be really important for us moving forward. The risk management and compliance, this is a huge issue. PG&E, that was a great example before. They've now got such a limited confidence in what they know of the 6,800 miles of gas pipeline in California that this is a serious problem for those guys. We may not be dealing with some of those issues, but we sure are dealing with others where we've got health records and personally identifiable information. We've got a number of uses of public funds and so on that we've got to be able to maintain track of. And I think something that's quite interesting in our case is that we actually have a lot of parallels between what we do with administrative and academic archiving. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, which I think was a great recent project, was a prototype integration between a content management environment, the research hub that we're using on campus, and the services offered through the Merit repository of the CDR. So through drag and drop, we're actually now able to provide archiving services which were originally oriented towards academic materials, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be leveraging that for some of our administrative materials, which in our case become sort of an academic record source as well. Lots of really good information. Grab a look at that when you get a chance. So one thing that I wanted to talk about was, well, what do we mean by records management, electronic records management in the context of these 300 million different systems that we have on campus? And the orange stuff in the middle, I could have chosen different colors, but I got Vicodined out and chose orange and yellow. The orange stuff here is really kind of representing more traditional kinds of transactional or active content management. So those would be like my travel form, and once I've submitted my travel form and it got approved by somebody, there's kind of a transactional workflow that's going through. That could be from BFS, it could be from the HR system, it could be from Bearby. There is a lot of very complex retention and disposition policies and disposal policies that exist for campus. And the idea here is that when we're dealing with active content, when we declare these records for longer term archiving, we want to make sure that we're associating those transactions and so on with the correct disposition schedules and retention schedules and so on that will allow us to make sure that we're behaving with some sort of automation which is going to make the management of those records and getting rid of the stuff that we don't want to keep, which is a huge cost, going as quickly as possible. Once we've declared records, we can go off to the storage and preservation components. And like I say, I think we've got a really productive partnership going here right now with the CDL in terms of leveraging preservation services around digital media. And that's something that we're really hoping to leverage a lot over the next couple of years. One thing that's kind of interesting here when we talk about permanent archives, I noticed that when we're talking to the archivist's office, there's a really interesting, well, hey, I want to get rid of it as soon as I can, but you can't, we're an archive, but, so the cultural clash in some of these areas is quite interesting to take a look at, because we actually want to get rid of a reasonable amount of this information as soon as we can, whether it's for liability, whether it's for cost savings and so on. We don't want to do that with academic materials, or maybe we do. Anyway, ramble. So we're currently involved in a proof of concept project right now with the Archivist's office, with Human Resources and with the Chancellor's office here to take a look at some various techniques here that may allow us to start scaling some more sort of centrally available records management services across the campus. The idea here is that within probably 7 to 8 weeks, we'll be publishing sort of a paper of findings to the campus on what we can see here as being some of the core issues and core recommendations to support effectively an OE proposal to get some of these centralized services in place. So that is a pretty horrendous set of colors as well. But we're using a product called Alfresco for a generalized content management store called the Research Hub, which is hub.berkeley.edu. Anyone on campus can get some storage, 10 gigs of storage on that, and just use it as a general place to store electronic stuff. And the idea here with this architecture is that we can use centralized repositories and we can open them up into different kinds of portals, whether that be the Research Hub portal itself. We're working on other websites, for example, that can actually access the content that we're talking about as well. But clearly we've got the ability to also do email and desktop integrations with that to actually make sure that we can get content in. And the idea here is that we're also going to be using a piece of software which is also open source that supports the records management process needs, and have that integrated with a whole load of the core campus infrastructure as well. And as we've got here, being able to move content from something where somebody's submitting a record to having somebody who's declaring a record and making sure that all of the data is filled out and so on, and then taking a look at storing that for long periods of time over at the California Digital Library. So that's kind of the concept of what we're trying to put in place here. And I might as well, I'm sorry for people who are not fans of country music. That would include me. I have no idea why a cowboy hat came up on there. The thing that we're really trying to take a look at is what kind of metaphors can we use to expose these kinds of data and these kinds of applications together. So I'm going to do what my mum told me never to do, which is do a live demo. Okay, that's fairly horrendous too with the screen sizing. Let me just see if I can figure that out. So I have, this is my email client, and one of the things that you can see down here in my email client is that I've got a whole set of file folders that are actually presented from the Alfresco record store. And if I wanted to, I could drag a folder, an email, and say SharePoint 15. And I say, you know what? I like the sound of that. I want to put it in Chancellor's emails because I have the ability to do so. So what it's basically doing is showing email integration directly with the software that we're running on Alfresco. How much time do I have? 6 minutes. Awesome. So in my Alfresco system, and this is just kind of giving you a flavor of some of the things that you can do. I can see here on my Chancellor's emails that I can put in all sorts of information about. No, I can't, I'm lying. I can set up basically a set of rules-driven disposition schedules. For some reason, that is not coming up. My life cycle doesn't exist there. Maybe it will on the one that Josh set up. Or not. Sorry, my mum was right. So what I can actually do is a whole bunch of special settings on a folder, for example, to say, right, well, this is the kind of behavior that I want to see for anything that gets filed in this folder. So I can say, hey, keep for 30 days in here. Once it's past 30 days, translate that into a PDFA, which is a special kind of PDF for archiving. And I want to put that into the Merit repository at the CDL. And I want to send a notification that I've done something. So just by the fact that I've dragged a piece of content into that folder, it will actually automatically pick up what those disposition schedules should be. And the culling of that becomes an automatic feature of the platform, which saves an awful lot of time. Of course, I can go in and take a look at the contents of those files. And you can see here, and I don't know why, normally what you would see here is a preview of what that PDF looked like. But we can go in effectively and say, right, well, I want to be able to tag it up. Okay, so this really wasn't a good idea. Dilbert spewing resumes. That's got to be awesome. Document has no content. Okay. And I've got an undeclared record in the Chancellor's office, which talks to an email that I put in. So here's the preview of the email. One of the things I can do here is to say, right, well, you can see here that somebody submitted this as a record, and you'll see that these two little things are sticking up here. So this is metadata that has to be entered before I can declare this as a record. And so I could go in here and say, edit the metadata. Please edit the metadata. All right. and it's not letting me put an originator in. Awesome. Okay. If I did have the ability to enter the mandatory data in it, I could then actually go and declare it as a record at that point. So despite what you can see here, this actually does work. The idea here is to be able to provide this kind of thing so that people can kind of get to this automatically. One of the big features of the platforms themselves is to actually move up the thoughts about what policies do I have to abide by based on their ability to submit records. A records manager would actually review that metadata to make sure it was fine, and then they'd be able to declare that as a record, and there'd be a full audit trail that's kept in that mode. So in closing, anyone that's interested in this, feel free to contact the folks on this list. And we've got a site that people could go to, which has got general information about what's happening in terms of presentations and so on that we've got around records management. We're expecting, like I said, to produce this report out to the campus, sponsored through the Institutional Data Council, probably in the 7-week time frame, give them a chance to take a look at it as well. And we're seeing this actually as just a good example of what we should kind of be moving functionally towards that will allow us to concentrate on good taxonomies and services that will make it much easier for folks to do the right thing with their records. So, there you go.
I'm Josh Schneider, Processing Archivist for Institutional Records at the Bancroft Library. I just want to give another shout of thanks to Patrick, who came here the day after surgery to deliver his presentation. I'm also here to introduce the speakers for our next session, Digital Materials, Long-Term Preservation and Access. The first speaker is Mary Elings, the Archivist for Digital Collections at the Bancroft Library. And the seed for holding this symposium actually grew out of a digital curation committee at the Bancroft that Mary chaired. And we're very grateful to Mary and the rest of the committee for their work. Our second speaker will be Stephen Abrams, Associate Director of the UC Curation Center, aka UC3, at the California Digital Library. Stephen was gracious enough to agree to speak with very little notice, and we thank him for that. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker to the stage, Mary Elings, Archivist for Digital Collections at Bancroft Library.
Thank you. I'm going to try and stay with the podium so that you don't lose me, because I'm not good at walking around with the mic. So I'm going to be talking about digital materials at the Bancroft. And I'm really focusing on sort of that second life that Kathy talked about earlier, where the archives have come to the Bancroft, and we are now looking at different strategies, and I'll talk about different strategies that we use to manage those materials, provide access to them, and ultimately preserve them for the long term, which is our responsibility. So I'm going to look a little bit first at the past and what we've done with digital materials. So the Bancroft has actually been dealing with digitizing archival materials since 1995. We have over 350,000 unique items digitized. These include maps, papers, reports, photographs, newspapers, and letters, and so on. We also have over 2.5 million pages of digitized books online. And we provide access to these materials primarily through the Online Archive of California, which has been mentioned a few times, which is a service of the California Digital Library. Through the Online Archive of California, we provide access to collection descriptions, and these descriptions are usually large inventories for sometimes quite massive collections. 300 or 400 cartons at times will be described in a collection inventory or finding aid. And then if any of the materials within that collection have been digitized, we'll link out of the collection description to the digital content. And Calisphere, which is another site that the Online Archive, the California Digital Library provides, will also give us access to our digital content directly. So it's a digital object search. So those are the two main ways that we provide access to our digitized archives. We also have our digital books on the Internet Archive, who helped us to digitize those, and then they're also available through the Hathi Trust. Okay, so we also don't do all this work by ourselves. We have some really great partners that we work with. We have the UC Berkeley Library Applications and Publishing Group within our library, who provide the technical infrastructure support for the work that we're doing. They provide us with a content management system that we collect the metadata or all the description about our archival collections, and also for our digital objects, and we use that to manage that content. They also provide the digital library systems that we rely on to present and preserve this material. They provide encoding and programming. They provide digital asset management and local preservation and access. So they do quite a lot for us. The California Digital Library, and my colleague Steve Abrams will talk about this a little bit more, provide the Online Archive of California and Calisphere in terms of access for us. We don't provide much local access. We let everything go into these large aggregations of content so that they're better for the researcher. They can find more material in there. I think there's over 200 different institutions that have their collection finding aids and digital content in the OAC and Calisphere. And then finally, Merit for preservation. We just heard a little bit about Merit, and that's where we preserve our digital content, is through Merit. So when I talk about access to digital collections in a little pretty simple to understand schema, we use very widely adopted standards. And the reason we use widely adopted standards to do our work is that we want to move all this content forward so that it has a very long second life. We do our collection descriptions for our archival collections in an XML schema called Encoded Archival Description, or EAD. If we have a collection that has had digitized information or material digitized from it, we will point out to that digital content and as a digital object, and the digitized content will be comprised of description of that digital object as well as the content files. So you'll see images, text, or audiovisual files wrapped in that digital object with its description. And that's wrapped in another XML schema called Metadata Encoding and Transmission Schema, or standard. So this configuration, what it allows us to do is to let our collection descriptions and our digital objects be searched together, or as with Calisphere, they can search just the digital objects by themselves. So this gives us more flexibility in giving researchers access, which is that second life that we're giving these digital archives. So what does this look like in practice? We have here a finding aid that's on the Online Archive of California. This is a large collection of papers, correspondence, letters for the Abdur Doble collection. There's an overview of the collection description on the left, and then on the right there's a listing of the contents of the collection. If we move down into the contents list, we'll see here in, which you guys can't see, but in Carton 2, Folder 46, we have an online item, which means that report was actually digitized. And you see that right there. So what this does in theory is, when you're in the finding aid, you can click on the online object, go to that digitized object. That digitized object is composed of files and description, but they're linked together. And here's that digital object. We see some description on the right-hand side that goes in that describes the digital object, the report, and then all the thumbnails or images of that report on the left. You click on those, and you can just page through the report. Okay. And then also, it goes in both directions. So if you're on Calisphere and you found this digital object, if you look down here at the bottom, there's a link back up to the collection finding aid. So we have a nice enclosed loop of access to this digital archival material. Okay, so while we have a very mature infrastructure for dealing with analog materials that are digitized and put online, when we're dealing with born digital materials, which we've heard a lot about today, and electronic records, it's really quite a different world, and looks very different than our analog world. So first of all, no analog version often exists. We're dealing sometimes just with files that exist as zeros and ones. There is no physical version of that file. For current things that are coming in today, we're dealing a lot with obsolete file formats. We're dealing with Lotus 123, WordStar, WordPerfect files that are coming in today. They're coming into us on degrading floppies, on hard drives, on personal computers. I get entire Macs that are brought into me and say, here's the archive of so-and-so. And so, we have to deal with that. But we're also dealing with laptops. But as more and more of this work starts to go out to web services, we're also going to start dealing with this, which is the cloud. And we really have not a lot of strategies for dealing with those yet, the cloud materials, but we're working on that. So what are some of the strategies that we are using to deal with this material, to manage it, to make it accessible, and to ultimately preserve it? There are a couple of different strategies. The first is refreshment. So we will refresh files by moving them from an eclipsing media format to a more stable format. So for instance, from crumbling floppy disk onto, if we can, our servers that are backed up and have some preservation processes on them. We can also migrate. So we can move from, say, a WordStar file to a more current and accessible file format so that when we put these out so that users can access them, they'll be able to open that file and view it. And one of those formats is PDF or PDF-A, which is the archival format of PDF. Also emulation. So for instance, if you have a hard drive from a very important writer and maybe you want to look at their work process, and you might want to emulate the entire operating system of his work environment, or emulate the software and how it ran a program. So if you think about those of you who have like the little Pac-Man emulators or the Pong emulators, they're running old software and they're mimicking how it used to function. One of the more promising strategies, and this was one that the group that Josh mentioned, the digital curation group, looked at, was digital forensics. Digital forensics is a way to actually go out, capture, and authenticate, and in some cases describe data or born digital materials or electronic records that exist on a hard drive or on a disk. So authentication is obviously an important thing. The Vice Chancellor mentioned it this morning. For an archive, it's very important that the records have authenticity, that someone knows that we didn't alter those records in any way. So digital forensics is a very promising area that we're exploring, and our Digital Curation Committee wrote a report talking about how we might want to use this new technology. And if you think about like the Enron cases where they had to go out and pull data, or IRS goes out and pulls data off people's computers, that's the kind of software we're talking about. So what we do know about digital materials and electronic records is they must be preserved digitally. And that is a big, big amount of work for us to do because there's a lot of joy and sorrow when you deal with digital materials, right? We have a lot of increased functionality. We're able to share these files. We're able to mass produce them. We're able to put them in lots of different places, which is terrific on some levels, but it also increases volatility. So from the Stone Age, which was very difficult to reproduce through the book, to now a tablet, we have a lot of increased functionality, but we also have a lot of volatility. And so it's a big challenge to move those materials forward. Okay, so just really quickly in closing, planning for a digital future involves some of the things we've talked about today. Having an appropriate system documentation when you send records to the archives is incredibly important. Electronic records should be kept on a medium in a format suitable to long-term access and readability before they come to the archives. And archives, as opposed to being just the end game or the second life, should be really involved in early on in the process. And that's really what this whole symposium is about, is to really reach out and start talking to records managers about the process before that record is created, because really preservation and access planning begin at the point that that file is created. And on that note, our end game is generally digital preservation, so I'm going to turn it over to Steve Abrams from the CDL, and he's going to talk about Merit and the work that UC3 is doing about digital preservation. Thank you. to it.
Thank you, Mary. Well, good afternoon. I am coming here with very little advance notice. I think I heard about this last Friday or so. But I'm always very happy to come and talk about the work that we are doing. And you'll probably find that out when you try to stop me at the end of my 15 minutes. I'll just keep on going. It's my bad habit. As mentioned, I do work at the UC Curation Center at the CDL. This is a relatively new organization, created really just about a year and a half ago now, as a partnership between the California Digital Library, the 10 UC campuses, primarily the library systems on those campuses, as well as a number of external content and technology partners. And our mission was really to try to offer a set of innovative solutions in reaction to these very significant and key challenges that we find ourselves in, particularly with respect to digital content. In essence, there's this ever-increasing growth in the number, the size, the complexity, and the diversity of the content that we're being asked to accept a stewardship obligation for. There's also increasing number and diversity of the type of stakeholders that we're dealing with. Traditionally, at the CDL, we've always worked with the campus library systems, but now we're really extending that reach to all constituencies on the campuses, faculty, staff, research units, and so forth. All of this is happening at a time when we're really seeing decreasing resources that are being made available to us, unfortunately, a situation I think you're all very familiar with. And since we're dealing with this sort of archival time spans, we know there's this inevitability of often highly disruptive technological change that we have to deal with. So in looking at that, we like to say that successful curation outcomes are really highly dependent on a tripartite foundation. It's very easy, all too easy often, to see this as solely as a technical problem and that all we need is the right technical solution, the magic box that will just put the stuff in and somehow it's all going to work out in the end. And while it's certainly true that we do need a robust technical infrastructure, that absolutely has to be matched with really core staff skill sets, decision making, all of which is in the context of a very stable and sustainable organization. We really can't make any real strides towards having long-lived content if there are not long-lived organizations that are available to steward that material over time. So while curation and preservation, it's a very complex set of activities, I like to think of it in terms of these 5 key, what I call curation imperatives. And, oh, my formatting is a little bit off. Like many of the other speakers, I don't have a real computer. I have a PC. So this is one of those disruptive technological changes, actually. So it was clever of me, wasn't it, to put this in here. First of all, you have to know what it is you have. There's the old adage in business management, you can't manage what you can't measure, and it is certainly true in the preservation arena. The types of solutions you offer are always going to be very highly dependent on these very specific problems you are being faced with. So knowing what you have is really fundamental. You then need to have a way to express and share that knowledge, express it in a way that is both ideally machine actionable as well as humanly understandable, so that it can in fact be easily shared. We want to do that sharing because as we've learned from the Stanford LOCKSS project, lots of copies keep stuff safe. Essentially, replication and heterogeneity are really 2 of the key strategies for the long-term preservation of electronic materials because they help you to avoid both single points of failure as well as potential systemic failures that might come about if you have sort of a technological monoculture. Then, of course, obviously, you have to protect the copies, particularly if you're operating in a highly replicated environment. You want to make sure that all of those replicas are, in fact, faithful copies of each other. You don't want them to be getting out of sync with each other, because then how do you know which is which is the canonical version. And then finally, of course, you need to plan, monitor, and intervene as necessary. It's what we always are striving to do, is to be as proactive as possible. Because unlike when we were dealing with traditional analog materials, where sort of the benign neglect model actually turned out to work pretty well, with electronic materials, of course, any significant interruption in sort of proactive management may result in irretrievable data loss. But of course, when you're dealing with the future, you can only plan for what you can plan for. Donald Rumsfeld might have said that better, with known knowns and unknown unknowns. So we do have to be able to ensure that we're able to be appropriately responsive as the situations merit. Of course, there's a lot more details behind all of this, and oh dear. Well, we have in fact published pretty widely about our approach and a lot of the technical details. So there's some pointers here. I imagine we'll be getting you copies of all of these presentations after the fact, so you'll be able to get those URLs. And there's some URLs on my closing slide as well. So at UC3 we have, oh, my formatting gets worse and worse. I apologize. We have a growing roster of services and tools that address various activities throughout the full information lifecycle. As Mary just alluded to previously, it's very important that we can try to intrude a preservation awareness as early as possible in the life cycle of these digital assets. There are lots of decisions, most of which are probably today being made implicitly or without real thought at the very beginning of an asset's creation or initial acquisition, that can have serious consequences on downstream preservation activities. So the earlier we can intrude, the better. Because this is unfortunately a fairly short talk about long-term activities, I'm going to focus on two, and of course not the two that are now circled, but the two that are slightly further down. I'm almost afraid to advance the slide here now. So first of all, we want to talk about our MeritCuration repository. We call it a curation repository because it was explicitly designed and implemented to encompass both preservation and access, which we see as entirely complementary as opposed to disparate activities. You can't have access unless there has been, in fact, preservation up to that point in time, and preservation can be seen as nothing more than ensuring access over time. There are no real eligibility guidelines. We're able to pretty much take in any kind of content, regardless of discipline, regardless of format, of structure, and so forth. The system itself is based on a new architectural paradigm known as microservices. I won't go into any of the details, but essentially this is a way that we think offers our technical infrastructure a great deal of flexibility with regard to customization, and we feel it also allows us to be very nimble in terms of responding to changing technological conditions. Because I mentioned earlier on the importance of having sustainable organizations and sustainable sets of services. We're very cognizant nowadays about the financial aspects of operating a service such as this. At the CDL, we are now being increasingly asked to operate at least on some sort of partial cost recovery basis, and perhaps moving more and more towards a full cost recovery over time. So we are in the process of developing a price model that it will have, in fact, two different options to meet different circumstances. One is sort of the pay-as-you-go model, where we send out a bill every year. Hopefully, you pay us every year. That works well for organizations and content managers that in turn have reliable and stable forms of annual funding to do that. But especially when we're dealing now with a lot of faculty and research projects on the various campuses, where it's sort of the money has a very strict time bound. We're increasingly being asked to have some sort of a paid up or what might be called an endowment price model, where there will be a one-time upfront payment of a lump sum that hopefully will be sufficient to throw off enough income over time to pay for subsequent preservation activities over either a fixed or potentially an indefinite term. One of the main components going into our particular costs for preservation, of course, is the actual storage that's taking place. We're right now managing about 65 or 70 terabytes, so that starts to add up. Luckily, we're able to negotiate with data centers on all of the 10 UC campuses, so we're able to offer really the rock bottom price, at least as far as storage goes. We're working primarily now with the San Diego Supercomputer Center down at UC San Diego, and that in the pay-as-you-go model, that works out to something around 65 to 70 cents a gigabyte a year, which we think is what a deal. We have identified 4 main modes of use of the Merit repository. First of all is as a dark archive. Historically, this is sort of where we started out about 10 years ago when we first started offering a repository solution. At that time, it was mostly dealing with cultural heritage and humanities materials, primarily from the campus library systems. This can be either born digital or digitized material, and as I mentioned before, there are really essentially no prescriptive requirements. You can basically send us everything, and we can accept it, and we'll do the best that we can with that material. Beyond that, though, there's a number of people, a number of customers who want to use Merit essentially as their publishing platform. They want to be able to publish and share the material, so we can also operate as a bright archive. And then this third option is probably what we see is over time what we expect to be the most popular, which is Merit can function as a preservation backend to other external discovery and content management or digital asset management systems. And we're showing here a couple of partnerships that we're working on. One with Patrick, already mentioned, with the use of Alfresco and Research Hub. We're also pursuing integration between Merit with the Omeka online presentation tool and the Islandora repository. Essentially, we'll be swapping out the Fedora repository for Merit, which will be sitting then beneath a Drupal front end. This last integration with data grids, that's probably of more interest in the scientific realm, so I won't spend real time talking about that. Our other main service offering I wanted to mention is our web archiving service. Really, over the last 10 years, the web has transformed everything. The ubiquity of 24/7 online access to everything is the new normal. So if we want to get the content that people are using today, we have to go where it is, which is out on the web. And that is what this service is to do. It is a comprehensive environment for letting you capture, web, and manage and preserve web-based resources. Again, there's a couple of highlights with regard to the ways in which you can use this. Obviously, building archives for particular communities of use. We've spent a lot of time to ensure that you don't have to come to this service with any specialized knowledge with regard to web archiving per se. All you really need to bring is your subject expertise. You have complete curatorial control over the capture process, what it is you want to capture, what are the sites you want to capture, what is the periodicity at which you want to go back and continue to capture this to show how things would change over time. Because the IP issues around web materials can be a little bit difficult, we try to do our captures in a rights-aware manner. We do follow the recommendations of the Library of Congress's Section 108 study group, which talks a lot about what are the library fair use exceptions in the context of web archiving. Although normally we do abide by robots exclusion mechanisms. This is a way in which a website owner can basically tell crawlers such as us or Google or anyone else, don't come and take my stuff. There are in fact cases where our curators tell us to go in and to temporarily ignore that. One case in point, for example, last year during the Japanese tsunami, in fact the National Diet Library went around and was asking us, as well as other similar organizations, please come and document the Japanese web space. Our attention is obviously elsewhere, but we want to capture this, so just go in and get it and don't worry about the robots and so forth. Let's see, then just to finish up here, I'm towards the end, wanted to mention a couple of, as a case study, the use of WAS already in the context of a couple of different university archives that are already using the service to document their web spaces. The first three, Arkansas, Davis, and Irvine, being fairly aggressive in terms of what it is they're capturing. None of those are public yet, but the University of Michigan, which is actually the most aggressive of those four, almost 700 websites that they're capturing, and that is in fact a public archive. You can go and take a look at what that would look like. And just as a point of information, we did a quick little survey just the other day. Berkeley is even larger than Michigan. It has about 935 unique websites within the Berkeley domain. If you wanted to be try to go out and be really comprehensive at capturing and documenting the Berkeley web space. So I will then, I think, close things up. Here are some pointers to more information. And I will end there. Thank you.